Look at these two scenes. Why does the second feel more alive? The lighting's the same, the objects are the same, but somehow it just looks better. That's because raw rendering alone, just geometry and lighting, has its limitation. It can feel flat, soulless. No amount of extra vertices will fix that. This is where post-processing steps in. The secret sauce that adds drama, depth, and style after the scene's been rendered. Think lens flares, motion blur, bloom, effects that turn a basic image into something cinematic. So in today's lineup, let's break down some of the most common post-processing effects. Before delving into the actual effects, we need to understand exactly how post-processing effects are applied. All games with post-processing first render out the scene as normal in something called a first pass. If we generate a texture and bind it to a frame buffer and render to that frame buffer, we can capture this first pass onto the texture. It can then be passed into a post-processing shader so that it can be sampled. This shader is then attached to a quad covering the whole screen and rendered to a user's screen. If we just sample the first pass texture and out that as a pixel color or frag color, we'll see the scene as normal. This is where we can now begin to add effects inside of this shader that manipulate that first pass texture. One of the simplest yet most common post-processing effects found in games, and photographers override it in Lightroom to create their deep and thought-provoking photos. The effect stems from a lens limitation on early cameras where you would get light fall off at the edges of the frame, something that we just agreed made an image look more cinematic. The effect is created in our post-processing shader using any function that creates a mask that fades at the edges. Here's a good one I found by OnShaderToy. All we then have to do is sample the first pass texture and multiply it by the vignette, darkening the result. Film grain is another effect designed to imitate real-world flaws in cameras to create a cinematic look. This is another effect that's quite simple to replicate in post, where we calculate a random noise texture and multiply the first pass texture by it, giving us this ugly as shit outcome. First, the grain is way too strong. If we multiply the grain by a strength value, the whites become less pronounced. Subtract this value from 1, causing the darker grain to be inverted, so that when it comes to multiplying the first pass texture by it, it has overall less effect. The second issue is that the grain is static, so we'll need to generate a couple of noise textures and pass them through to a post-processing shader. We can then shift what one we're sampling by using time and just keep looping through this set of textures, shifting the grain. The personal love of every PS1 style indie horror game on itch, it's a love it or hate it sort of effect. A brilliant add-on when done subtly, but an absolute shite show when developers crank it up to the absolute max. The effect itself comes from a phenomenon found in camera lenses where different wavelengths of light get refracted by different amounts when entering the camera lens, causing light to separate into different sections of colour, an effect seen on that album that no one's listened to. And it's this separation of wavelengths that results in those vibrant edges surrounding the objects in photos. We begin by setting a focal point typically within the center of the frame at 0.5 in UV space. We get the UV coordinate of the current fragment and calculate the difference between the frag coordinate and focal point. We'll then use this vector to offset the sampling point of the first pass texture per color channel, using varying offset amounts for each color. Output all of these sample values, giving chromatic aberration. Bloom is probably the godfather of all post-processing effects in games, being used in everything for 20 odd years at this rate. It helps in cranking up the strength and believability of lights, sometimes to the extent of blinding you, by imitating the bright glow given off by lights in the real world. The reason this is thought to happen is that bright light can overwhelm your eyes or the center of a camera, diffusing across the sensors so that the light is picked up across a wider area. The effect is a little more complex than the previous, requiring us to calculate a separate bloom texture on top of the first pass texture that captures all pixels on screen with a color value greater than a certain threshold. We can get this bloom texture by understanding that frame buffers can have multiple color attachments, basically multiple outlets the fragment shader can output to. Our first pass texture runs off of the first color attachment, which is what our out frag color in our fragment shaders output to. If we generate another texture with the exact same properties as the first pass texture, yet bind it to a second color attachment of the same frame buffer, we can now go back into our fragment shader we used to render our objects with and set it up to output to this second color attachment as well. When setting the value of frag color, we can then take that final color and run a quick check to see if it's beyond a certain threshold. If so, we output that value to the new out bloom variable. If we check our bloom texture, we should see these values appear. We now need to take the newly filled bloom texture and blur it, typically via a 2-pass Gaussian blur to give a hazy look to all bright objects. This texture is then passed into a post shader where we run an additive blend to merge the first pass texture and the bloom texture. The fifth and final effect we'll cover today is another love it or hate it effect for many people. Personally, I don't see the fuss, but hey, God forbid someone have an opinion. The effect has had many iterations, with the days of old doing this weird accumulation blend sort of motion blur, which just looked dog shit, to the newer, more modern per object or per pixel implementations that actually look decent. The whole premise of motion blur is that in cameras, an exposure is captured over a set period of time for a blended outcome, presenting motion with blur. GPUs, on the other hand, capture a single instantaneous point in time with no real ability to blend multiple renders without noticeable gaps, unless of course you're rendering thousands of frames per second, which I don't think many of us are doing. For the better per object motion blur, we must begin by storing a velocity in each pixel of a velocity map that we can use to selectively apply directional blur in post. To calculate such a map, we first store the previous and current model matrices of all objects on scene, allowing us to capture both their previous and current vertex positions. Then with this, velocity becomes as simple as just current vertex position minus previous vertex position. To get this map, we'll follow the same method we did with getting the bloom texture, where we'll generate a velocity texture with the same properties as the first pass texture and bind it to a frame buffer we used to get the first pass render. Now on the third color attachment. Inside of the vertex shader we used to render the objects, we'll take in the previous and current model matrices and calculate the previous and current vertex positions. These are then sent into a fragment shader where we take the two and run perspective divides and range scaling on each, converting the coordinates into 0 to 1 screen space, which is the same coordinate space that the post-processing shader runs off of. Subtract the previous position from the current position, giving us the velocity of this fragment. We'll set up the shader to now output to the third color attachment and set this value equal to that calculated velocity. This gives us our velocity map. Now we have to run that directional blur. This will require us to construct another texture and frame buffer that we'll render to, this time for our blur output. Another new shader will be created where we'll send through the velocity and first pass textures. This shader is going to be rendered onto a quad that covers the entire screen that will allow us to capture the blur result, similar to what we do with the post-processing shader. Inside of the fragment shader, we calculate the screen UV, the position on screen the pixel is at in UV space. We'll use this to source the velocity of the pixel from the velocity texture and calculate speed from this. This will allow us to figure out how many blur samples will be required based on the magnitude of the speed. Now we can perform our blur, running a loop for the same period of time as the number of samples, where we can calculate an offset using our velocity. We then sample the first pass texture at the point of our screen UV plus that offset, this sample then being summed onto a total value. Once this loop is complete, we divide that total value by the number of samples, averaging it. We output this final average value as the frag color of the shader. Now it's as simple as plugging this blur texture into a post-processing shader as the first pass texture, and we have per object motion blur. If you also capture and use the previous view and projection matrices, you can get full screen motion blur, but most people aren't fond of this. And that's it. You can see how adding even just a few of these effects has imbued so much more life to the scene, and these effects aren't even all that complicated to implement or to run. Shout out to the sources I used in creating these effects: John Chapman's article on the per object motion blur, David Lettier's article on the implementation of chromatic aberration, this video by Digital Foundry going into the history and theory behind motion blur, and Pixel Prophecy's video on the idea behind chromatic aberration. Cheers for watching, and I'll see you in the next.